McCarthy is the founding curator of the CIA Exhibit Center at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. Now from the National Archives and Records Administration, she discusses her new self-published book, Spies, Pop Flies, and French Fries. In it, Miss McCarthy reveals the content of her private tours of the museum and shares stories of various people connected to the agency, including baseball player Mo Berg, actress Marlene Dietrich, and TV chef Julia Child. It's 45 minutes.
Well, let's get started, shall we? Lynn McCarthy comes to us all the way from the mountains of Virginia, the Shenandoah Valley. She was an employee of the CIA for 24 years. She helped create the CIA Exhibit Center, which is close to the public, but I understand it's a marvelous exhibit hall. And after her retirement, she has gone on to create History is a Hoot, and is here today. She is also a great advocate of preservation, has won many awards. And ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Linda McCarthy.
Well, first of all, let me say what a pleasure it is to be back at the archives on this, the actual birth date of the Office of Strategic Services. Now, everybody knows what we're talking about when we say OSS and Office of Strategic Services, right? OSS, oh so social or oh so secret. And it was all of those and more. And it was actually founded on this date 60 years ago, in 1942. Now, people ask me how I got involved in the OSS, because I was an employee of the CIA, which you probably know is the modern-day successor to the OSS. I find the OSS and the people still alive who served in it absolutely fascinating. And thankfully, I have many, many friends who are themselves OSS veterans, and they graciously and generously share their time and stories with me. So it's a razz for me. It really is. I enjoy it, and I hope at the end of the day you get a feeling for how special the OSS really was. I invite you, too, when you're talking to Sam in the archives, to remember that all of the declassified documents dealing with OSS found their home here in the National Archives. Why? The CIA had to put them somewhere, and it was a logical conclusion that it would come here where, to the extent possible, they're declassified and you can read them. And some of them are fascinating. It gives you an eye on the window of the world of these men and women who were doing just incredible deeds for this country 60 years ago. Now, yes, the OSS did hire women. Actually, 1/3 of its 13,000 members were women. And I'm happy to say that, because back in the days, yes, back in the days where we really had glass ceilings, that's an incredible number. But William J. Donovan, who headed the OSS, founded the OSS, was its only director, said, I don't care who you are as long as you can do the job for me. And in that tremendous envelope, he brought baseball players, actors, film director John Ford. I'm sure some of his stuff is here. In fact, speaking of John Ford, most of the U.S. government footage you see of something like D-Day or any place where the boys are going ashore, chances are John Ford and or his men that he brought with him from California filmed that for the OSS. John Ford always wanted to be in the Navy, but his eyesight was bad. Donovan said, I don't care about your eyes. You know how to work a camera. So not only was he documenting the war, he was performing strategic intelligence runs. This business of Normandy, are we going to land at the Pas-de-Calais or at Normandy? It's John Ford and his men going back and forth with aerial sorties suggesting to the Germans that it's going to go down at the Pas-de-Calais. Why? It's closer, less of the channel to traverse, but things like that. Did you know that John Ford was OSS? It's an incredible story. Another one of my favorites is Morris Mo Berg. Anybody heard of Mo Berg? How do you know Mo?
Well, he was a baseball player who was also an espionage agent.
Yes, indeed. He's considered one of this country's foremost atomic spies. Now think of that in the context of baseball players. I mean, I enjoy the sport immensely. I have very good friends at Cooperstown. But sometimes today's players, when you look at yesterday's players, you wonder where the relevancy is. Well, with Mo, he loved baseball, absolutely adored baseball. But he also loved being an espionage agent. And quite honestly, he was probably doing that for this government before there was an OSS. Now, you understand that OSS was this nation's first centralized intelligence service. Up until then, in 1942, we had hints, suggestions, minor attempts at this business of collecting intelligence for the United States government. But the business of collecting intelligence actually goes all the way back to the days of George Washington, even before. Washington is considered this nation's first spy master, the guy with the wooden teeth, did all this stuff at Mount Vernon, established this nation. One way he was able to win the American Revolution was the fact that he had a better espionage network here in the States. In fact, the head of the British intelligence service at the time during the American Revolution, after things did not go too well for him and his friends down at Yorktown, when this guy got back to Great Britain, he said to the Great Britain press officials, George Washington did not outfight us, he outspied us. So it gives you an idea of the importance of espionage, intelligence gathering, whatever euphemism you want to ascribe to it, to the business of this nation and where we are even today. The different discussions you hear about intelligence and where it has been and where it's going. But Washington started this. Why? Less men and less materiel. He had to know where to put them to achieve the stuff he wanted to achieve. So up until the time of the OSS, there were various and sundry attempts to get some sort of information on our enemies and, quite frankly, on our friends. But nothing was really solidified until June 13th, 1942, when Franklin Roosevelt, who just loved this business of spying, said to William J. Donovan, okay, I'm going to make you head of this Office of Strategic Services. And that's where you got this nation's first formalized intelligence service. Now, they were an incredible group of men and women. We talked about some of the entertainers. One of my dear friends is Betty McIntosh. She herself was an OSS morale operations officer. And you read what's going on in today's context of trying to get those who would destroy us to maybe better understand us. That's what Betty was doing with the Japanese 60 years ago. It's like, does anybody read history anymore? Because it's right out there, and it's in these documents here at the archives that talk about what we were doing in terms of morale or psychological operations, however you want to tag it. It's the same thing. Now, the other thing about the OSS, they had wonderful training facilities. Oddly enough, not all of them have, shall we say, been acknowledged. Anybody in here familiar with Prince William Forest Park, the glorious stretch of open land in Prince William County on 95? The OSS trained there. It trained their commo guys, and it trained their operational types. One thing I like to tell about that particular training venue, known as Area A, is that's where the OSS taught its men, and I have yet to find one woman, but I will eventually, to use its one-man sub, the Sleeping Beauty. It was one of these things, probably just a little longer than this table, where you were the operative and the operator. In other words, you had to know how to pilot that thing to where you needed to go to perform whatever little dastardly deed you were going to do on behalf of the United States government. But they practiced it there in Quantico Creek. So the next time you hear Quantico, think, oh, that's where the OSS, these super secret spies, were learning to use the Sleeping Beauty, which was their one-man sub. Now, the head of research and development in the OSS was one Dr. Stanley Lovell, who Donovan affectionately referred to as Professor Moriarty, after the evil genius in the Sherlock Holmes mysteries. So that gives you an idea of where these men and women were coming from in terms of, hey, let's try it. And if it works, we'll do it. There were many things they tried that didn't, but the litany of things they did try and succeeded with, we're still enjoying the fruits of that labor today. One example of that is Julia Child. Anybody familiar with that name? I hope so. She's considered by People magazine and a few other these icons of the American press one of the trailblazers of the 20th century. Not so much for what she did working with the OSS, but of course what she did in terms of cable television, public television. But yes, Julia McWilliams at that time served with the OSS, and she will demur and say she was just a clerk. They were told to say that. Women in particular. And, 9 times out of 10, they really were. But others who showed some promise or intuition toward another direction were lopped up. Didn't matter if they wore a skirt or not. That was not the overriding concern. The overriding concern is, can you do it and will you do it? Well, in the case of Julia McWilliams, she showed General Donovan there at E Street. Everybody know where E Street is? Down across from the Kennedy Center. You look up those glorious old buildings. That was the headquarters of the OSS. It was also the first headquarters of the CIA. Why? We didn't have that snappy new building until Eisenhower came over and turned the spadeful of dirt well after the war had ended. So the CIA started out there too, but that's where Donovan and company hung their hat, establishing the OSS. Well, Julia was assigned there as an administrative clerk, and believe me, I do not denigrate clerks, because I'm used to getting paid and I know who's responsible for them, the finance clerks. Well, in Julia's case, she was doing that sort of thing, but somehow, some way, she got selected for a special amphibious task force. And what they were doing was looking for a way to basically protect the lives of downed pilots and there were a few of those, and even maybe the guy in the Sleeping Beauty ran into trouble. What are we going to do to protect these men? One of the concerns was sharks. Sharks are very curious animals. Sharks can really mess up an intelligence operation. One of the ways sharks did this was we were having problems with U-boats in the Atlantic, familiar with the Battle of the Atlantic, who's going to control the shipping lanes? Part of the problem was we decided, the Allies, Great Britain, the United States, that perhaps we'd start blowing U-boats out of the water, which would be probably the most rational way of dealing with them, and that required underwater amphibious detonating devices. And that was a good idea, except that sometimes sharks would bother them. Now, the worst thing that could happen for the shark is it blew him out of the water, but the worst thing that happened for the intelligence mission is it exposed it. So what did the Germans do? Chances are it wasn't enough of the limpets, which is one of the apparatuses they attached to the side of the U-boat, to totally do the U-boat in. They'd simply move it. It was a cat and mouse game. But along comes things like shark repellent. And it's the idea of keep the sharks away from the men and the material. So the next time you think about Julia Child, think about her part in, no pun intended, cooking up the shark recipe, because she did. Now, she did it with a team of men and a couple of other women right here in D.C. in the Tempo buildings, if you know where they were during the war. But it's the idea, yes, she was hired as a clerical, but if you showed some inclination in another direction, Donovan or whoever was in charge was going to say the favorite buzzwords, let's try it. And sometimes that got them into trouble, needless to say. But more often than not with the OSS, they had this can-do attitude, which, quite frankly, I don't often see, the bureaucracy being what it is, and I think sometimes that's a stranglehold. But Donovan paid a price for that. October 1, 1945, Harry Truman disbanded the OSS. And that's the other remarkable thing about the organization. It was only around for 2.5 years. But think of what strides it made in that limited amount of time. This nation's first centralized intelligence service. It had proven the worth of intelligence gathering, which is a euphemism for spying. Operationally, morale ops, which again is just psychological warfare, and we're thinking today, how can we maybe make inroads into other people's minds and ways of looking at us? History does repeat itself. The OSS is a very good study in this. Now, some of the other luminaries, one of my favorites, Sterling Hayden. Yeah, he was OSS. Mr. Good-looking, they called him the Olympic goddess just because he was just a wonderfully good-looking man. He was a well-paid Hollywood actor, and he didn't have to leave to join the war effort. He could have gotten one of the many exemptions. He not only left the war effort, but he left the war effort to join the Marines. And one thing you have to remember about OSS, it was both civilian and military. It didn't matter if you had something up there. Donovan didn't care. Just, can you do it? I need you for maybe one day, maybe 1 week, maybe 1 year. But that's the way they worked together with this. In the case of Sterling Hayden, he came out of Parris Island, a freshly minted lieutenant, and then made it to captain. Then Donovan said, how would you like to join my little party? And what he ended up doing for the OSS was fishing some of our pilots and some people trying to get out of the bad place that was Yugoslavia at the time, out of the Adriatic, just picking them out. He was always a sailor. Sterling Hayden loved to sail. He had two loves, writing and sailing. And with the OSS, that was sailing right there. And when he finished his service, he went right back to being an actor again. And on the Paramount lot, I think it was, he was awarded the Silver Star for his service as an OSS operative. But these are the kinds of luminaries that Donovan was able to bring into the fold. That's where you got the oh-so-social. Did these men and women like what they were doing? They will tell you it was the best years of their lives. And even Julia Child says that to a certain extent. And if you think of one of the wonderful things she's done, that's an incredible endorsement. Basically established public broadcasting as we know it. And many people credit her with the establishment of the cable industry as we know it. Why? It's selective viewing. So when you watch Julia with the flambe and chasing the liver on the table, think of her as an OSS employee, because sometimes she does too, and they're very, very proud of it. The other thing about the OSS when it came to the daring do was some of what they created besides the Sleeping Beauty, Dr. Moriarty. One of my favorites is something they developed called the Beano. It's simply a hand grenade, your basic hand grenade, but it's the exact dimension circumference of an American baseball. Why? They figured everyone in the service, male, female, civilian, military, would have at one time or another thrown a baseball. So they'd have a certain comfort level with that particular feel and design. So they had this grenade called a Beano. Now, why do you think they called it a Beano? When you bean a pitcher, that's where it comes from. Sometimes I think they had as much fun creating the actual artifact and then naming it. Another one of these that I really enjoy, and quite frankly, and you can see one of these up close and personal, I had the honor of doing a special display on women operatives that's now being featured at the Women's Military Memorial there at the ceremonial gate of Arlington National Cemetery. And yeah, I finally got to talk about my spy gals. Quite honestly, it hadn't been done till then. When I was doing displays at the CIA, whenever I could kind of slip one of my female operatives in, I would. But to actually do a display that was devoted entirely to women, it hasn't been done before. So I had a great deal of fun with that. It was an unpainted canvas to me. Well, one of my favorites that I have on display there is the doggy-doo transmitter. OSS developed a homing device, and you can see this on display down at the Spy Gals display. It's about, I guess, 3 inches long, and it looks like something you do not want to step in. Quite frankly, you're going to go walk around it, or at the very least, it's going to blend into the train as a piece of dirt litter. Well, inside is, for the time, a very sophisticated homing device. It's powered by 3 nickel-cadmium batteries, and I've included an X-ray of its gut so you can see the actual internal workings of it. It's a homing device, and what people would do, working behind the lines, you go out here and, oh, there's a nice flat area for an airdrop. Whether you're trying to get men in, men out, material in, material out, you need a good space where they can do the airdrop. So you go out and you scout this. There's no GPS then. There's nothing like that. But you do have these little homing devices. So you basically activate that thing and just throw it down, and the planes going over will pick it up and go, that's where they want the airdrop. But it looks like a piece of dog-doo, and it's called the doggy-doo transmitter. So if you get across the river sometime before the end of the year, it's there till December, take a look at the doggy-doo transmitter, developed for OSS, and quite frankly, used by the CIA. Why? These things work so well during the Second World War. Why would we just cast them aside when we're fighting the Cold War? So yeah, a lot of this stuff had an incarnation in the Cold War. Another one of my favorites, it has to do with something that looks an awful lot like a prophylactic. We're all adults here, right? It looks like that, and they fill it with some horrendous substance that, after a certain amount of time, would eat through not only the rubber shield, but an engine casing. So you get the little operative kind of wheeling into town, looking around. French resistance use these things a lot. Pop the hood, throw it in there. And after fashion, this thing just ate through. It not only disabled the engine, it completely annihilated it. It's not like you could send the shade tree mechanic over and go repair the thing. It wasn't going to happen. But that was an OSS device. Another one of my favorites is the exploding coal. OSS, World War II, was the advent of plastic as we know it. Up until then, you didn't have the Tupperware parties. Plastic was not the thing that it is today. Well, back in World War II, OSS saw a wonderful venue for plastic. They made all sorts of little booby traps and gizmos like that. And one of my favorites is the exploding coal, where they simply kept a cavity in something that looks like coal made of plastic, and in that they put explosives, usually plastique. And you get a little operative, again, one of the guys just bicycling through town there in one of those controlled sectors in France, sees a train, just kind of scoffs it up there, and the next thing you know, after he's long out of Dodge, the thing explodes. You've disabled a troop train, material train, whatever. Not only have you done damage to that particular vehicle, but you probably tied up the tracks. Incredible amount of stuff. This is the kind of stuff they dealt with. Now, speaking of operatives who work behind the lines, one of my favorite is somebody perhaps you haven't heard of. Anybody heard of Virginia Hall? An unpainted canvas. I love it. When I do these little dog and ponies in front of college groups or high school groups, I invariably get some young man or woman that says, oh yeah, Virginia Hall, it's a dorm at Mary Baldwin. No, well it is, actually, I've seen it, but not my Virginia Hall. She was an incredible female operative during World War II for the OSS, actually started out with the SOE, the British Intelligence Organization. She's from nearby Baltimore, Maryland, just across the river. She had a wooden leg. She's known as the famous limping lady of the OSS, which is an odd moniker until you read about her. This woman grew up in the upper strata of Baltimore, went to nice schools, but decided she wanted a career in the Foreign Service. A career in the Foreign Service during the days before World War II didn't get you much beyond that desk. Quite frankly, that was it if you were female. This woman was terribly gifted. She had a command of languages. She was socially placed, so she knew how to behave with a group of people. So she got herself assigned to different posts as a clerk with the American embassies. Actually had a hunting accident where she suffered the loss of her right leg below the knee, so she had to wear a wooden leg. That did not stop her at all. When World War II broke out, she found out that she couldn't get beyond that desk, so what did she do? She went to the Brits and they hired her. And it was the Brits who taught her how to blow up this, that, and the other thing, saboteur, and things like that. She got very good at it. She worked behind the lines for the Brits. She actually earned the Member of the British Empire from the King. Now, after a fashion, it dawned on her, you know, I'm an American. I think I'd like to work for the American Intelligence Service. And by that time, she had a pedigree. And Donovan, yes, come work for me, and I'll put you back behind the lines if that's what you want. And that's exactly what she wanted. Even though she was known in France, had to do with one of the double agents who blew her cover when she was working for the Brits, where did she ask to go? Back to France. Why? She had a network in place there, people she knew, she worked with, she trusted. She thought, I can make great strides on behalf of the Allied cause if you just put me back into France. And of course, people in Washington are going, that's ludicrous. You're not. She says, no, leave me alone with this. I can handle it. Well, one thing about Virginia, very statuesque, very nice bearing. So how did she disguise herself? Walked with a sloop as an old peasant woman. And because she knew French, knew German, she just blended right in. Now the wooden leg, that presented another problem. It did cause her to walk with a discernible limp, but she learned to, slooping, actually pull it along to where you could not tell that that woman in that peasant garb had a wooden leg. So what is she doing in occupied France for the Americans? Well, she's making preparations for D-Day, which, as we know, was one big party there along the Atlantic Wall. One of the first things that happened when the word went out that D-Day was going down was they cut the communication lines. So the Germans were basically stranded. They couldn't communicate with each other. In fact, there's some speculation that Hitler didn't really understand that this was indeed going down in Normandy instead of the Pas-de-Calais until well after D-Day had gotten down. Why? Because Virginia and other operatives working with the French resistance known as the Maquis, which is Corsican for wild underbrush, so that gives you an idea of where these people were coming from, had been doing things like cutting the telegraph line. In the case of Virginia, she actually added to her credibility and currency by learning Morse code. So she became a wireless operator, her own wireless operator. During the day, she'd do things like make goat cheese and then go into town and sell the goat cheese, all the while listening to what's going on. The Germans are occupying, they're saying things, loose lips sink ships. Very good intelligence operative on the ground. She takes this information back after selling her goat cheese to where she has stashed the radio and takes the radio, and I've held it, it's, I don't know, 50 pounds, but it's dead weight, and climbs to usually a hayloft or someplace higher elevation and starts keying information to headquarters London. And it's very important information. So when the Maquis and company cut the lines, people who could do that were invaluable. That's why we were able to communicate with our men and women behind the lines and the ones that were advancing across the fields of Normandy. Now, oddly enough, she had some problems with this leg, but she never let it stop her in terms of what she wanted to do. One of the things she constantly sought was the socks that you put between the stump and the wooden apparatus itself to cushion it. One time she had to hike across the Pyrenees, I believe it was. Yeah, and the stump became very bloody. So she was very concerned about keeping enough of the socks to keep the leg from rubbing against what was left of the stump. So every once and again, she'd have to wire headquarters London for a supply of these things. And after a while, they knew who it was with this rather cryptic, odd message on the other end. It went something like, Cuthbert is giving me trouble, but I can cope. Cuthbert was the code name she gave her leg. So anybody on the other end listening to that would know, oh, it's Virginia Hall, she's having a problem with her amputated leg, send her some of those socks. Ordinarily, that worked just fine. However, there was an instance where we had an unknowing little individual on the other end in London listening to this rather odd message, Cuthbert is giving you trouble. He wires our keys back, if Cuthbert's giving you trouble, have him eliminated. In other words, shoot yourself in the foot again. And she says, no, 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 that won't work. Why did she have to disguise her wooden leg? Well, remember, she's well known. She is known as the most dangerous operative in all of Allied France by the Germans themselves. The woman with the wooden leg is the most dangerous Allied agent, male or female, in all of occupied France. So if it went out over the wire, and the Germans were listening in, we know they were listening in, that this person was having trouble with an amputation, it's Virginia Hall, and they'd immediately find out her location, and that would probably be the end of her and whatever she was doing on behalf of the Allies. So that's why she developed this little code about Cuthbert. She always referred to the leg as Cuthbert. Now, I mentioned again the Women's Spies display. She's one of the 7 women I included in it. Why? Because people invariably don't know of her, and I think that's sad, because she did incredible work for this country. In fact, she earned the MBE from the Brits, and this nation bestowed upon her the Distinguished Service Cross, which, as you know, is the 2nd highest military award for bravery after the Medal of Honor. And she was a civilian female. She was the first civilian female to receive this award, and it was because of her daring do in occupied France. Now, at the end of the war, Truman had disbanded the OSS. General Donovan went up to Truman and says, I have this agent, and you might want to confer this decoration upon her. She's been approved for the Distinguished Service Cross, and we think it's worthy of a White House ceremony. And Truman agreed. So a cable went out to where Virginia was still in London cleaning up after the war. The President of the United States would like to bestow upon you in a White House ceremony the Distinguished Service Cross. Please respond. Well, Virginia gets this, and she goes, oh, she's mortified for a couple of reasons. One, she kind of liked the undercover world, and if there was going to be some successor to the OSS in the Cold War era, she'd like to be a part of it. And you don't do that, blow your cover at a White House ceremony where C-SPAN might show up. You just don't do that. That's not good etiquette. The other thing, she says, I am busy here. She felt obligated to the men and women who had basically sustained her as a covert operative. And she says, no, I'm tired, I'm busy. So she got this cable back to headquarters here in OSS in Washington. I'm sorry, but I still have work to do here. She stiffed the President of the United States. Now, what they did do, when she wrapped things up and got back across the Atlantic, Donovan, in a very quiet ceremony there in the East Street headquarters building we talked about, conferred upon her the DSC with only her mother in attendance. So that gives you an idea of this woman's focus and dedication to what she was doing. So I included her, even though I have luminaries in there like Julia Child. Another one, Marlene Dietrich. Anybody know that she did PSYOPs, morale ops? It was the idea that she was a very, very popular woman in Germany. Sad to say that when she kind of renounced Hitler, he did not treat her too well, so she renounced her German citizenship in 1937 and became an American citizen. And what the OSS wanted her to do in the worst kind of way was to basically perform American songs, popular American songs, in German, and the OSS, through its Black Ops program, Black Operations program, would beam these back to guess where? Behind the lines in Germany. And you got, oh, it's Marlena singing about life in Germany. I'm so lonely. I just want to throw down my weapon and go home. In some cases that happened. Now what they did do was get a poor guy to translate these songs overnight into German, and Lila Marlene said, I'd be honored to do this. So they put her in a recording studio, and she recorded all these popular songs that we're used to hearing of the era, and they beamed them back to Germany. One of the reasons they wanted to do it, in addition to having them think about putting down their arms and going home, was we wanted the Germans to hang around on our radio frequency and listen to, quite frankly, the propaganda, why we were fighting this war and why the American side was going to win. But, you know, they got wise to that. After fashion, they just started turning it off. However, if they thought there was a chance that Lila Marlene was going to show up any time on a record and start singing one of their songs, one of the American songs in their language, they'd hang around. They'd listen to the entire transmission. So not only were they get these maudlin songs about Germany in German, they were getting American propaganda. So that's Lila Marlene. She's featured down there too. And another one which was not OSS, but I mention her because up until 1937, she herself was an American citizen, was Josephine Baker. Familiar with her? An incredible story. She worked for the French Resistance because at that point she was a French citizen. Why? Had not been treated too well in terms of civil rights here in this nation. So she found a welcome audience in Paris who understood her rather risque review, and she settled there. Spoke French beautifully. The Parisians loved her. So when World War II broke out, she wanted to do something like Julie McWilliams and Virginia Hall. They could have stayed home, but they didn't. In the case of Josephine Baker, she basically said to the head of the French resistance, "You may use me as you wish." And they did. Why? Because Josephine Baker had entree to just about every venue there on the European continent and even in North Africa. Why? She was Josephine Baker. She could even be performing a review there. So one of the neat stories about her, and I won't dwell on her because I want you to go look at the display across the river, sheet music. She's a performer. She's going to have sheet music. Well, in the margins in invisible ink, the resistance had written all sorts of classified information that she was passing back and forth. So until 1937, she was an American citizen, having been born in St. Louis. So I've included her as well. Now back to the OSS for a second. How would you like to play with some OSS toys? Yeah, okay. I do have a collection of toys, and people think I'm denigrating the artifacts when I call them toys. No, to those of us who revere these things, they are just wonderful toys that OSS concocted during World War II. Where did I get them? Well, quite frankly, a lot of the OSSers give them to me. Why? I think they trust me with the artifact and the story it represents and the service they themselves are very proud of. And they have an understanding for me that I will never sell it, I will never trade it. What I'd like to do with it eventually when I get through doing these educational outreach programs like this is give it to a museum, just so others can enjoy it. But in the meantime, I'm having a lot of fun with them. The other thing, you're familiar with that entity known as eBay? You can get some good stuff on eBay. I just caution you to be careful because there's so many, well, I'll be polite and say reproductions out there. Reproductions being sold as the original article. You just got to know who you're buying from, and that happens whether you're buying Civil War, OSS, even Cold War artifacts. But this stuff that I have here today comes from a collection of places. And we'll start with my favorite, the caltrops. I cover them up so you people aren't looking at them while I'm talking. Okay, white gloves. Why the white gloves? Yes, we have an archivist here. How'd you know that, sir?
I read.
There you go. Hand oils, hand hair, anything is oily. All this is very acidic when you're talking about old metal, old documents like here in the archives. You come visit Sam and you want to look at something, the first thing he's going to do is hand you the white gloves and make sure that you keep off of it. What I have here are 3 caltrops. Thank you, Sam. Anybody know what a caltrop is?
For horses or against horses.
That's where it started, yes. It's the idea of if you cripple a horse, you cripple an army. It started back in the Crusades is where these things gained their fame. Now that's inherently cruel, but it's also inherently effective. We use it today. We use them in counterterrorism raids. Does that phrase ring a bell to anyone, counterterrorism? When the Israelis had their plane hijacked in Entebbe, and they wanted it back, one of the first things they did was line the tarmac with hundreds, thousands of these things so that plane could not take off. And there is a modern day equivalent, commercial equivalent of it here, even in DC. You erroneously end up in the wrong parking garage and those things go up behind you and you're not going to back up because you know what's going to happen to your tire and maybe your tailpipe. They're just caltrops on a strip. That's all it is. Let's start with this guy. He's my oldest one. Caltrop, they tell me, is from the French meaning thistle or the Middle English, whoever you talk to, but it comes from a derivative of thistle. And if you look at these things and use your imagination, I guess there is a thistle in there. But if you notice, this thing is made from one continuous piece of metal. It's unisassembly. Any way you throw it, it's going to land prong up. The idea is put one behind and one in front. The OSSers, many of whom I spoke to about things like caltrops, say, Linda, we always ask for as many of these things as they would hand us, but always we wanted at a minimum 2. Why? One for the front and one for the back. You could cripple buses, planes, anything, Jeeps, where you've got a rubber tire. Now this one, for being an early version of the World War II model, had a particular problem. OSS was the advent, World War II was the advent of the self-sealing tire. That was a big deal. Put the tire around this and it just wrapped. And theoretically, you could go down the road, but you'd get where you're going eventually. OSS says, no, we can do better than that. So they came up with this little guy, which has an air cavity. Anywhere you throw it, it's going to land prong up. Tire would wrap itself around there, but because there was an air channel, the air would feed directly out. And there you'd have your flat tire, where this might disable it a few miles down the road. One of my favorites, this nasty little thing, if you handle it wrong, you'll need a tetanus shot. This is called the Christmas tree caltrop. Looks like a Christmas tree. I have 35 of these because I had an opportunity to get them. And someone asked me, what are you going to do with 35 of these? Line my driveway when people tear up and don't want to slow down. But more important, I can trade this for something. But this is a Christmas tree caltrop. There are ninja caltrops. Martial artists use them today. They usually are smaller. They fit in your hand. You just throw them out when you see somebody advancing toward you, whether it's a person or a horse, and it's going to stop them pretty darn good. In the case of this, you can use these as a defensive weapon. You're kind of holding it like that. And it's your last resort. Strategically placed, you could kill somebody with one of these. But I hang on to it thinking one day on the Beltway when I'm run off by a tractor trailer, I'll be ready. But those are caltrops, and I've made kind of a science of studying these things. There's one that I'd love to get from the World War I generation that actually had prongs about yay long, and they buried those around the trenches in the sand to keep you from crawling over, anything like that. I've seen those for sale, and the last one I saw went for a little more than I was willing to pay for it. But caltrops, right up from the Crusades to today. And this little guy. This is the Matchbox camera. So named because it resembles a box of wooden matches. It was meant to be something you could easily put in your pocket, not draw any attention to, unless you're coming into the archives and you have to call them ahead and say you're bringing this stuff, because this is going to set off magnetometers and all sorts of things. Needless to say, when I do these talks, I'm going to Maui to do a talk in September. Sadly, this stuff can't follow me. You can imagine what kind of chaos this would create in an airport today. Seriously. So I don't even bother. I don't want it confiscated, impounded, certainly kept. But with this guy, it's a 16 millimeter. People think primarily to take people. No, it was used principally to take documents. Why? You want to steal the plans to the Lido-Burma Road, but you don't want to walk out with them like this. First of all, you're going to draw attention to yourself. Secondly, somebody's going to notice eventually they're gone. And they're going to figure who was the last person to have these things, and chances are they might finger you. But if you're in there surreptitiously photographing them, and then you walk out and stick this in your pocket, it's called pocket litter in the spy trade. It's kind of innocuous. No one's really going to sound the alarm unless you try to get on a plane at Dulles Airport with it. Now, the other neat thing about this, to further camouflage it, this is plain. It hasn't been used. But if they were dropping you into Britain, you got a British match motif. If you were getting into France, you had a French logo pasted on it, just something to camouflage it even more. This was used right up through parts of the Cold War. Why? Because it was so darned effective. It's an embodiment, as these are, of the KISS principle. Familiar with that? Keep it simple, stupid. And it is very effective, cheap to operate, cheap to manufacture, easy to conceal, but darn good at what it was designed to do. And OSS, whether you're male or female, they use these things all the time. So that gives you a little flavor about the OSS. Does anyone have any questions? Yes, sir.
Did the OSS interrogate the German saboteurs who landed on the beaches of Long Island, Florida, before they were executed to find out what the Germans were doing? And
quite honestly, I don't know. There has a lot to do, that sort of subject, with what's been declassified. And I'm just not sure what's out there yet. I'm just not sure. So I have to err on the side of caution and say I just don't know.
Mr. Coleman?
Yes, I wondered
Yes,
if you
sir.
might say something about Julia going to China.
Julia in China. How do you know Julia in China? How did you know about Julia in China?
Well, I've heard people give programs on women in the OSS. So.
Julia ended up in China. One of Betty McIntosh's favorite stories, she and Julia flew over the hump together, that mountain range that people dread. And Julia was sitting there cool as a cucumber reading a book. Everybody else on the plane is white-knuckled. There's Julia just reading a book. What she did over there, she was head of the registry. And that is to say, every piece of paper that came and went out of that particular OSS office, she saw. She had to approve in some way, shape, or form. She called it, after a fashion, the top secret twitch, because she was getting just a little nervous looking at all this heady stuff that she was reading day in and day out. But that's principally what she did when she got in China. It was in the Far East where she met Paul Child, Julia Child. Paul was himself an OSS operative. Oh, name it, this man could do it. Take pictures, draw pictures, new languages. He was one of those operatives that you wanted working for you. And he and Julia struck up a friendship, became a romance, devoted to each other. They married after they got back here. Anybody? Yes, sir.
Was Margaret Mead a recruiter for the CIA or for the OSS?
I just found out from my friend Betty that Betty McIntosh actually took a course in morale operations from Margaret Mead. And I was interviewing Betty. I'm starting an oral history of the OSSers that were kind enough to share this stuff with me and will humor me long enough to serve me lunch as I'm taping their little stories, to tell me some of the intimacies dealing with the OSS, because they're just now getting to the point where they're comfortable discussing it. And Betty mentioned almost casually that she took a course in psychological operations from Margaret Mead. And you listen to me on the tape and I'm blathering. You studied Margaret Mead? Yes, Margaret Mead and her husband at the time were two very big morale operations types for the OSS.
Linda, I actually have two questions.
Uh-oh.
First is, you watch movies on TV today, you watch movies where you have a James Bond, a flamboyant, very ostentatious spy. But in lectures that some of you attended in the past dealing with submarines, it seems like those who were involved with submarines, the thrill was not getting the attention, but sneaking up on someone, staying behind them, learning all that you could, and then sneaking away, never being known, that you were following them. Is that the same kind of mentality that OSS agents had that you would interview? I mean, what was the thrill of doing what they did?
First of all, they will tell you to a person that they were happy to do what they did for their country, and I'm happy to hear that. The other thing, it was fun. Julia, Betty, all the people I've talked to will say they were some of the best days of their life. But in terms of the actual operational aspect, this was heady stuff. And women in particular, there's that desk. But not if you could show an inclination in another direction. You were doing some really heady stuff. It was the thrill of the chase. It was working with contemporaries for a change. And it was doing something that was vital to the war effort. So yeah, they loved that service. And many of them bemoan the fact that Mr. Truman in 1945 disbanded it.
Last question. Tell us about, you left the Central Intelligence Agency in 1997 and you formed History as a Hoot. Tell us more about that.
When I was at the agency, my last 10 years, I ran something I started called the CIA Exhibit Center. And if you want job security, start your own little niche in a government building. What I did was create a museum. Why? I found these toys fascinating. And when people saw that I had a certain reverence for them, guess what? They started surfacing. Now, these were federal property, of course. They were former OSSers who had turned them into the CIA because there was that succeeding element there. But there was no place to put them. I was working in a place that dealt with old books, and these people, God love them, thought I must be dealing with old things. So I was happy to take the toys. And that's how the museum started. Now, when I left the agency in '97, I had collected some of these on my own. And I decided, if people were happy hearing about the toys and the men and women who used them on the inside, imagine the reception I get on the outside. No one has thrown me off a stage yet. And I've talked to very young, very old, all kinds of audiences. So I thought, this might be a vehicle for my private life. So I started History as a Hoot. Why? Because history is incredibly fun. I don't find it boring. I'm sorry for those who do, but chances are when they hear talk about the caltrops, they don't think it's boring either. So what I do is, through my company, as I go around, Sam humors me once or twice a year, and talk about different aspects of this kind of stuff. Having written the book, I can kind of peddle that too. So that's my company, and I have fun with it.
Ladies and gentlemen, Linda McCarthy.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, Sam.
I'd like to thank C-SPAN and Book TV for coming, and I'll also thank you all for coming. We're going to adjourn to this corner of the room where we will now have our book signing, and you can ask more questions to Linda McCarthy. Thank you all very much.
Linda McCarthy is a 24-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency and the founding curator of the CIA Exhibit Center. Spies, Pop Flies, and French Fries is published by History is a Hoot Incorporated. For more information, write them at the address on your screen, P.O. Box 285, Markham, Virginia, 22643.